In these uncertain economic times, it's easy to be worried about protecting your wealth, your hard-earned savings, and your family's financial future. Plunging interest rates, the devaluating dollar, and political unrest constantly threaten what you have worked hard to earn and all that you own. That's why now it's more important than ever to protect your assets and have the money you need to make your dreams come true. Welcome to the Global Wealth Fortress Report with successful global entrepreneur and wealth preservation expert Joel Nagel. Joel's helped thousands of people just like you protect what you have so that you can make even more and make your every dream come true. So, sit back and enjoy Joel Nagel's offshore expert advice on how you can live the good life at a great price, where the sun never sets on your financial fortress.
Hi, it's Carib Carter-Clues. Welcome to Joel Nagel's Global Wealth Fortress Report. A little background on today's program. A couple of days ago, I said to Joel, I just read an article in Investopedia saying essentially Panama is a tax haven. Is that accurate? And he wrote back, and I said, should we talk about that? He wrote back in a great answer. He said, let's zoom out to 30,000 feet and talk about, quote, international financial centers, which is the proper term for tax havens. And we can talk about Panama, Belize, Switzerland, Singapore, etc. So folks, tighten your seatbelt because this should be a pretty fascinating topic. Joel, what about those international financial centers?
Great. Hi. Hey, Carter. It's good to be with you. And always, it's a great topic. So I love talking about this topic and also kind of separating out a little bit of the reality from the hype. And, you know, sometimes financial centers called offshore havens are given a bad rap. I mean, and sometimes they deserve it. But there's also very viable, very legal uses of financial centers. And, you know, I'm glad we can talk about that a little bit. You know, before we start, I want to remind people that the largest financial center or tax haven, if you will, in the world is the United States. And now you're going to say, what the heck are you talking about? How is
not for me?
Exactly. That's it. As Americans, we all get to pay tax, not only on money we earn here, but on money we earn worldwide because, you know, our tax system is based on nationality. It's not based on residency like most other systems. So if you're an American citizen, green card holder, you know, permanent resident, if you live in the United States, you're going to pay tax on your worldwide income. Now, what's the flip side of that coin? And that is that if you don't live in the United States, you're not a citizen, you're not a green card holder, but you invest your money in the United States, guess how much tax you pay? Zero.
Are you serious?
So, I am totally serious. So if a German, you know, if a German citizen buys Apple stock today, you know, for $100 and sells it a couple years from now for $200, they pay zero capital gains tax. Now, there's some exceptions to that rule regarding active businesses in the States and real estate. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, it's very, very easy to for foreigners to invest in the United States and pay no U.S. tax. And that, by its very definition, is an international financial center or a tax haven.
Yeah,
exactly. So I think that's important for people to realize. And sometimes, you know, the U.S. comes down really hard on these little tiny countries in the Caribbean or other parts of the world because, they don't have high tax rates. But the reality is, you know, the U.S. leads the way. And whenever I see, you know, compilations of the largest tax havens in the world from an asset perspective, the U.S. is always number one. I think Cayman Islands is usually number two. Switzerland and Caymans are usually 2 and 3. So, you know, again, U.S. is number one. And a lot of what the United States laws have done in recent years has been to only make those numbers grow greater. So, for example, there's a lot of regulations on foreign banks that do business with Americans under a regime called FATCA. I know you're right. Familiar with that, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. But guess what? The Europeans have something similar, And the US said, well, we're not going to participate. So we demand that everybody turn over information to the US IRS, and the US in return gives nothing in return. So again, we're making it very easy for foreigners from all over the world, and sometimes through corporate structures in places like Delaware, South Dakota, Nevada, where you don't even have to list who the shareholders of these corporate structures are. That's where you get into trouble. And there have been reports, for example, that Vladimir Putin has substantial wealth in the United States through some of these companies because they can't really say who the underlying owner of the assets is. Meanwhile, in other financial centers, and it's generally agreed that there's 43 financial centers in the world, and these are jurisdictions that have either no tax or low tax, very, very low tax, and they use their tax system to encourage money to be invested, in that jurisdiction. Now, as I said, as an American, even if you do that, you're not going to in any way avoid or escape U.S. tax. You're still going to pay your U.S. tax. But, let me give you a good example. Let's imagine that I partner with a German and we decide we're going to do a business 50-50. And if we do that business in the United States, the German might be subject to U.S. tax and then repatriate money to Germany, might pay tax again. If we do that business in Germany, the opposite could happen. So I might end up paying more tax because it's going to pass through two tax systems. But if we set up a company in the Cayman Islands where there's zero tax, what would happen is the company would pay no tax. But then the portion that was distributed to me as a shareholder would be subject to U.S. tax under U.S. rules, and the portion distributed to the German would be subject to German tax rules. So that's where you get into tax efficiency. You're not necessarily eliminating tax, but you're making sure that you're not adding a second, a third, in some cases a fourth layer of tax. Because at the end of the day, if you're a wealthy person, you live in Los Angeles, let's say you live in Beverly Hills, California, you're paying Beverly Hills tax, you're paying, California tax, both of which are progressive and can be quite onerous. Then you're paying U.S. tax. So you're already into 3 levels of tax. The last thing you want to pay is another level of tax. So that's really how financial centers can be helpful and useful. That's just one example.
Let me ask you this, just for a point of clarification. So if I gave my wife's mother, who's my wife, you can't do it, but she has a green card. She has a permanent right. But if I gave my wife's mother, who lives in Honduras, money to invest in Apple, as you said, then she would not have to pay U.S. taxes on the dividends. Is that right?
Well, not on capital gains. There's no tax
not on capital gains.
On dividends and interest income. It's what's called U.S. source income. So there is some tax on that. It's probably still less than what you'd be paying. You get into some issues there because if you do that on purpose to structure your activities where it's really still your money, the IRS is going to come after you. But if it's a real true gift, let's say your wife decides to give money to her mother, there are limitations on how much gifting you can do, particularly to non-U.S. person, without incurring tax on the gift itself. But let's assume you could give her, $10,000 and then she invested it and then she made a capital gain. You're absolutely correct. She would owe no U.S. income tax on the gain. On
the capital gains. Very good. Very good. I should have told my wife not to get permanent residency.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing. I actually have a lot of clients, and when they marry, they specifically don't let their wives or husbands, and in many cases, they don't even want their children to get U.S. citizenship for that reason. Because remember, almost every other country in the world taxes you based on residence, meaning you live there. You spend more than 183 days in a country, and then you're subject to its tax system. But the U.S. says no, because you have the privilege of having U.S. passport. The last country to do that, by the way, was the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. They said, hey, you're a citizen of Rome and you'll pay your taxes because you're Roman, regardless of where you live. And I think that there's a little bit of insanity to that, quite frankly. It makes a lot more sense to tax people based on where they live and work and spend their time. Again, if you look to our neighbor to the north, Canada, that's exactly how their system is. So you can be a Canadian. If you don't live in Canada, you pay zero tax. If you live in Canada, you pay the normal taxes. If you move to France, you pay the French tax system. So that's the way the vast majority of the countries in the world are. But the U.S., the U.S. says no, we're taxing you based on citizenship. So circling back to the offshore financial centers,
Right.
again, these are jurisdictions that have low or no tax. Usually, you have very good access to global financial markets, and that's separately from the tax. That's become maybe the most important element of a financial center, is having easy access to whatever investment in the world you want to buy. Now, because of the way the U.S. regulates not only its citizens, its companies, but it tends to project its authority all around the world. And the United States Securities and Exchange Commission has taken the position now for several decades that if you sell an investment to a U.S. citizen anywhere in the world, that your company becomes subject to SEC rules and regulations. So you could be some, let's say Malaysian hedge fund with 300 Malaysian investors, and you decide to take one American investor, poof, now you're subject to U.S. Securities laws. And, that could be very onerous and detrimental. So, most of the world's investments are closed to U.S. citizens. So, of course, we know that money finds its way towards treated best. Americans want to invest in that hedge fund in Malaysia. What are they going to do? They're going to create the right kind of structure, the legal structure. Maybe it's a trust in Belize or a foundation in Panama or a company in the Cook Islands. And then they're going to use that entity to make that investment, because they're not going to limit or restrict that entity from that jurisdiction from investing in whatever the investment is. So many clients that come to me are coming to me to create legal structures so they can access investments that are closed to U.S. citizens. I mean, that I would say now is maybe, a very important use. And then the third use we've talked about several times on the program before is classic asset protection. When you move your money into a jurisdiction like that, and somebody wants to go after that asset, now they have to, instead of suing you in the United States, where we have very plaintiff-friendly legal systems, they have to go to one of these other jurisdictions like Panama and try to sue and go after the assets there. That can be very, very difficult or impossible, quite honestly. I mean, if you've properly created a trust in a place like Belize, Cook Islands, an Anstalt or a foundation in Liechtenstein, in Panama, in Switzerland, the list goes on and on. I think we've worked in over 43 financial centers around the world, but those centers specifically have very restrictive laws that make it difficult or impossible to access those funds. So you have asset protection, you have opening the doors to, investments, opening the doors to financial institutions, banks, insurance companies, hedge funds, mutual funds that are closed to Americans. These are the real reasons why people are still using these types of financial centers. There's in almost all cases, there's no financial benefit from an income tax perspective, but there is the benefit from the regulatory, from the asset protection, better estate planning. I mean, I could just go down the list of many other things, but I think I've touched on the main ones.
I want to ask you a question about Panama banking. Before I do, folks, I know that the viewers out there right now are saying to themselves the same thing that I'm saying, and that is, this guy's a genius about this stuff. So, folks, there's where you go. If you're going to deal at all in offshore, in finances, go to nagellaw.com. He is America's #1 asset protection attorney. And in this discussion, you're seeing why. The question about Panama now. If I put my money, the Investopedia article that I first broached you about, approached you about, said that if I put my money in the Panamanian bank account, and some litigation happy guy in this country decides to sue me, that the Panamanian bank will not cooperate. Is that right?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that doesn't mean it's impossible to access those assets, but the banks still believe in bank secrecy. Now, FATCA has eroded that to a certain extent. They're going to provide financial information to the U.S. IRS upon request from a tax perspective, but it generally is not available to a plaintiff who is suing you. An ex-spouse, an ex-partner, somebody who slips and falls in your grocery store. Those types of people, they sue you and go after assets there. The bank isn't even going to respond whether you have an account there or not. That's just not the way. Bank privacy and bank secrecy means client, bank, client. So the only person who's going to make a disclosure about that is you. And if you're in court and you have your hand on the Bible and you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, you will have to disclose that you have an account there. So the account is part of it. The legal structure is another part of it, because if it's just an account in a Panamanian bank in my name, and the judge says, well, Joel, bring this money back, or I'm going to hold you in contempt, then I don't really have any choice. But if I've properly settled, let's say, a trust, and the money's in the trust, and I say, well, it's a trust for my children, grandchildren, I set it up 10 years ago. I don't have access to it. And those things are true and not some sham. That's as a side note, people always contact me and say, oh, I heard about this case where, this offshore trust was pierced, or this, client had to give the money back, or whatever. The old saying that bad facts makes bad law and bad precedent is really true. In almost all those cases, there was something else going on. There's a case right now, I believe out of Illinois, where a wealthy individual just basically, screwed his wife, took the money offshore, put it in structures, and then denied he had access to it. And the court basically said, well, we don't believe you when you say you don't have access to it. And even if you don't, you can't benefit from creating your own impossibility. So they've sentenced the guy to go sit in jail, and until he cooperates with bringing the money back. But that's not a precedent to say that offshore jurisdictions, haven structures don't work. In fact, it's just the opposite. Legitimate, legally created structures work fine. But, to run around a ruse at the last minute to try to scam somebody, that's not fine. I mean, that's not the purpose of these types of structures. And even the jurisdictions themselves don't really want that. That's bad reputation for them, and they don't really want to get caught in the middle of that. So for example, in this case, after the fact, trying to screw your ex-wife by taking your money to Panama or Belize in this case, it wasn't a great idea, and I don't think it's going to work out very well for the fellow. But if you can imagine a different scenario where the person created a legal structure before he got married and put the money in the structure, then in fact, that kind of legal structure would be way better than a prenuptial agreement, because prenuptial agreements in the US are challenged and pierced all the time. And nobody says, oh, they don't work. People are still doing them every day for their intended purpose. Sometimes if they're drafted improperly, incorrectly, there's mistakes made, whatever, they can be pierced. But if you have assets in an offshore structure that you created, let's say a trust, before you got married, and you had already gifted those assets to the trust before you were married, or they could become a marital asset, then there's no way that anybody could go after those. And I don't think any judge would hold you in contempt and throw you in court the way this current case is playing out right now.
How about if you do it after you're married, but before your marriage hits the rocks?
Well, we've kind of discussed both ends of the spectrum. Now you're in the middle, and the question would be, whose assets were they? So if they were solely your assets, and there's lots of times that money can just belong to one person. In most states, for example, if a parent dies and leaves money to you, that's generally not considered a marital asset. So you could have been married 20 years. You could inherit money from your parents. They pass away. You take that money, you put it in offshore trust. Then 5 years later, you get divorced. Somebody says, "Hey, I want access to that money. It's a marital asset." If you had taken that money and commingled it in your, bank account at PNC or Citizens Bank or some other place, probably it would be a marital asset. But in this case, you took it immediately, you put it into an international trust structure or, some other kind of vehicle that was designed to sort of protect the nature of that asset. Then you would prevail in that case. That's my opinion. Of course, these are fact driven, and at the end of the day, a judge is going to decide. But the question is whether you want to be the low hanging fruit or you want to be the apple at the very top of the tree. And that's what we're really trying to do. We're trying to make it very, very difficult for potential would be creditors to go after your assets.
Let me ask you a question. If it's prying, just say that's prying. But have you had clients? Because you're the top asset, you're the asset oracle. Have you had clients come to you that were single and say, "Joel, I have great news. I'm going to get married. I've met a wonderful woman and all," or a man, I've read wonderful man. And you've said to them, "Well, that's all well and good, but we have to take a look at your assets and see how they can be protected." Have you ever done that? And if so, what was the reaction?
Yeah, no, I have done that. In fact, I threatened to fire a longtime close client a number of years ago. There's a woman who came from a very wealthy family, and she had been through a very nasty divorce. Most of her wealth was locked up by her parents in trust structures. And after that divorce, her parents passed away, and she became sort of the decision maker with regard to the assets. She was marrying a gentleman who she was, deeply in love with, who she said was extremely wealthy, came from another very wealthy family. She thought it would be offensive to bring up the idea of a prenup, and just said, "Well, if I'm telling you, it's in your interests, it's in your children's interests. I really believe you need to do this. If you don't do it, it's on you. But don't come back crying to me later. I'm not even gonna take your call if you don't listen to me." Wow. So she did listen to me, and the fellow said, "Oh yeah, of course, no problem." And as it turned out, 5-6 years later, he didn't really have the title and the wealth that he pretended to have, and he tried to in the divorce, he made a claim for division of assets and actually applied to get alimony in the state of Colorado, which Colorado is very progressive, and it's not a one-way street. It can go either way. And in fact, the trust structure and the prenup was upheld, and fellow got nothing. And now this woman at conferences and things, she's always the first to sing my praises and say, if I hadn't listened to Joel, then, half my wealth would be gone. So yeah, it's, particularly when you talk about generational wealth, look, if you make all your money and you want to blow it, go ahead. But if your parents, grandparents, great grandparents have made a lot of money and you're so fortunate to be really more of a steward, right? Because they didn't leave you this money to go out and buy, Lamborghinis and, or get stoned on sailboats at 3:00 in the afternoon. You're a steward of this wealth. Your duty is to guard it and pass it along to the next generation. And so there's lots of tools in the basket, from the legal structures, prenuptial agreements, as you mentioned, life insurance. That's another big tool, because if you blow too much of the family's wealth, but you have a big giant life insurance policy on yourself, whenever you die, then the family fortune is going to be somewhat restored. So we really look at this in terms of long-term generational wealth stewardship, wealth planning, wealth protection. And the old adage, before I worry about trying to make money, I just want to make sure, I help my clients keep what they already have.
That's great. That is great. One more question. The Key International Bank, with which you are obviously very much associated. I think you're the chairman, right? And it has the same protections as the Panama banks we discussed, right? in terms of people's privacy.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like all the other banks in Belize, it has, entered into agreements with the U.S. IRS concerning, FATCA for reporting of account information upon request from the IRS. But beyond that, lawyers, if a lawyer shows up with a judgment from California saying, tell me if you have money for this person. I mean, a foreign judgment doesn't mean anything in Belize. So, it's worth less than toilet paper, in fact. So, it again, the bank account isn't necessarily the solution by itself. It is good. I do believe it's good to get your money offshore. And if you only have a little bit of money and, you say, hey, I can't afford lawyers and structures or whatever, sure, open a bank account, put $5,000 or $10,000 there. It's sort of out of harm's way, right? It's not part of the low hanging fruit. But, if a judge orders you to bring that money back and you don't, then you're going to be wearing the orange jumpsuit and be in contempt of court. So it's creating not only the foreign bank accounts, but it's the foreign structures to make sure that you've legally transferred that asset to an asset protection trust or a private interest foundation, an Anstalt, those types of legal structures that, unlike companies, with a company, you own the shares of the company. But with these types of structures, there is no shareholder. There's a beneficiary in the documents, which is usually not you. It's usually your spouse, your children, whatever. So if somebody has a claim against you, they're not going to be able to march into a bank in Belize or, a brokerage account in Panama or a trust company in Cook Islands and say, here's my court order, fork over the money. It just doesn't work that way. So
excellent.
That's really what clients are using these structures for. And even though the transparency has gone up, the protections, in my view, have gotten more important because, let's face it, the U.S. is the most litigious country in the world. There's a new federal lawsuit filed every 17 seconds of every minute of every hour of every day. And if you add state lawsuits, it drops to about every 7 seconds. So, just while we've had this, this interview, there've been, I don't know, probably 1,000 lawsuits.
Easily.
So
Easily. Well, I think right now, none of us who have watched this program are experts now on international financial centers, but we do know who to call who is an expert. So this has been great. It's been excellent, Joel.
It has been good. And maybe in the future we can get into more details about specific ones. There's reasons why people pick Singapore versus, Caymans versus Switzerland. And, we could probably talk about that, but that's probably another whole show. So we'll do that sometime.
That's great. Thank you. This has been excellent. I mean, let me put it this way. When even I can understand something about finances, you have done a good job of explaining. So thank you.
It's the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you very much, folks. That is just great information. Look, however much money you have, think about securing some of it, securing those assets, at least part of it, offshore. And here's what I call. Now, because you just saw the interview. Thanks for joining us. As I always tell you, let's do this thing.